Tracking a shift in our pattern from dry January into a chance for showers this weekend. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods. I'm going to be breaking it all down. And we really need that shower chance to increase, especially with our red flag warning conditions continuing in Southern California with critical fire weather all the way into almost Santa Barbara, southward along the coast into the San Diego area to the border. We've got extremely dry conditions, and we're adding to that those gusty winds. So a particularly dangerous situation through early Tuesday with gusts up to about 50 and at times near 100 miles per hour. We have seen those gusts at times close to about 75 and over 80 miles per hour, even into our Monday evening. Still seeing those offshore winds continuing, those Santa Ana winds at roughly at about 30 to over 50, even 60 miles per hour. And that will continue overnight tonight as well. High wind warning in effect until Tuesday evening all throughout that general area with, again, very dry conditions. A repeated pattern of this setup with a high pressure ridge just up to the north and off generally to the west. And then we've got that low settling into the Great Basin, producing those offshore winds. We saw it in Northern California, but also for Southern California, those critically dry conditions elevating the fire danger with those Santa Ana winds. We will see tracking those changes, though, as a low pressure system starts to drop in. It'll be an inside slider just off to the east of California, but it will bring some cooler weather and the potential for some showers. We'll also see those warmer than average high temperatures start to come to an end. During the middle of the week, we'll see temperatures anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees above average, continuing to dry out that vegetation. And then all of a sudden, this big blast of cooler air comes in on Saturday. That will really be backing in, particularly to the Tahoe Basin, but also present those changes into Southern California with unseasonably cool weather for that location as well. So we're going to continue to have these extended forecasts, these in-depth looks at these weather pattern changes on ABC 10 Plus. Make sure you download it wherever you stream for free. It's live, local, and always on. Plus, we've got a look at our weather and climate specials there as well with a complete weather playlist. Here's a look at our statewide precipitation, and this really tells the story of why we have the winds in Northern California, but no red flag warning, whereas we have the winds in Southern California, and we get into not only red flag warning conditions, but also a particularly dangerous situation. That's going to be the most extreme type of red flag warning that we can have. Statewide precipitation, we are less than 1/10 of an inch since the beginning of the water year for Los Angeles, nearly that for San Diego. So for some monitoring locations, it's been the driest start to the water year for a couple of places in Los Angeles, as well as San Diego, Palm Springs, and downtown Los Angeles. The second driest start for the water year, but that mostly because we saw just a trace of rain in those locations. We're seeing those deficits grow, not only for Southern California, but also in Northern California. We were off to a great start to the water year, especially in November, which was one of the wettest that we had seen. And then December was, for all intents and purposes, basically average. But then by January, we really started to see things dry out here. And that's what's leading us to below average precipitation for Sacramento, San Francisco, Stockton, Modesto, parts of the Central Valley, all the way into Bakersfield with about an inch below average, whereas the beginning of the water year, again, started off with really great numbers. Here's a look at those downtown Sacramento numbers, and this just kind of illustrates what happened after we turn the calendar past 2024 to 2025. October, we generally don't see a whole lot of rain anyway. That just kind of opens things up for the rainy season. And by November, well, we got well above average, almost 4 inches of rain. December, closer to about average, about 3¼ inches of rain. And then January hit, and we've only had 3/10 of an inch. January, by the way, is usually our wettest month of the year. As you can see with our average monthly rainfall, we average about 3, almost 4 inches of rain in the month of January, and we've only seen 3/10 of an inch of rain. Now, February and March can still be very wet months, so there's still plenty of time to do some catching up. It's just that could cause concern for some flooding, especially around the Palisades fire, the Eaton fire. We'll have some burn scars there, and there could be some mudslides. So we have to be very cautious of what we wish for. We want that rain to kind of come in and come in at a steady pattern, not necessarily all at once with a huge atmospheric river. That could cause some real concern. As far as our January precipitation, this is the month so far, and we only had 0.3 of an inch of rain just after the new year on that Friday following welcoming in the new year. The average there at the bottom, 3.87 inches. So we have a lot of catching up to do, and it's really looking unlikely that we'll do that, especially with the rain that's expected for the weekend forecast. It looks like it's largely going to favor the east side of the state, not so much the west side of the state. And I'll explain why in just a moment. Here's a look at our top 5 driest Januaries. These dry stretches, by the way, are not terribly uncommon. We usually hit about a week or two in January, February, even December that we have the dry weather. It's kind of feast or famine in California. We hit 2 weeks of wet weather, 2 weeks of dry, and it kind of follows that pattern in general. That's not always the case, but in general, that's kind of what happened. The downtown Sacramento driest January on record was 2015. We only had 1/100th of an inch of precipitation. Now, the most recent one, 2022, well, that provided only 5/100ths of an inch of precipitation. Many of us remember that year. 2025 so far, it's going to be the 8th driest January on record with that 0.3 inches of rain, and it's very likely we'll kind of end there as well. Might get a little bit this weekend, but again, just doesn't look likely that we're going to get a huge deluge of rain. As I mentioned, winter dry stretches, very common, but they can be prolonged and they can really dig us into a hole. That 2022 year that I mentioned, the second driest January on record, well, that was the beginning of our longest winter dry stretch, which was back in 2022, January 8th, that lasted all the way through March 14th with 66 days of no measurable precipitation. Now, in the summer, those dry stretches are predictable. They happen every summer. So the all-time longest dry stretch that we've had for downtown Sacramento, 194 days without measurable rainfall. That was on May 13th through November 22nd in 1880. All right, so doesn't look like we're shaping up quite like that yet. We're under that ridge of high pressure. Here's the setup for today with that high pressure ridge overhead. There's that low settling into the Great Basin. I talked about those offshore winds, but this is going to start to relax as we head into our Tuesday. So the winds will actually start to back off first for Northern California and then kind of translate into Southern California throughout the evening and into our Wednesday. We're still under that ridge of high pressure, and it actually will be a pretty warm day for us on Wednesday. But then here comes this low, and as I mentioned, it's an inside slider. So what it's going to do is kind of tap into some of that cold air that has been plaguing much of the eastern half of the country and draw it in mainly to the eastern side of the state. But we'll generally start to cool that air mass as that storm track dips its way south. That's going to allow some of that colder air to settle on in. Keep in mind, we got that high pressure ridge just off to the west once again, and it will be right back with us heading into the following week. But in the meantime, let's take a look at what that low could potentially do. It could bring us more snowfall, and we need a little bit more, especially for the central and southern Sierra. We've hit this dry stretch here, and so the gains that we had in November and December are starting to kind of be erased by the dry stretch. We're still over 100% of average for the northern Sierra snowpack when we look at the snow water equivalent. If we were to take all that snow, melt it down, how much water would we be able to get? Well, at this point in the season, over 100% of what we usually get. For the Central Sierra, we're closer to about 75%, and then we're just slightly over 50% for the Southern Sierra. So our average to date for the statewide percentage is going to be 81. April 1st. Now, some people may wonder, well, why do you put that April 1st date on? Because that's the point where we start to see more in the way of snow melt instead of snowfall. And it's kind of a key indicator of how much water we'll be able to draw from that snowpack for the dry season. The snowpack, by the way, provides about 30% of our water supplies for the state. So it's a real important number there when we look at how much water we'll get from it, especially for the northern Sierra, because our biggest reservoirs are, in fact, in the northern part of the state, that being Shasta, Oroville, Trinity is a really big one as well. Folsom's a smaller one, but it does feed a bigger metropolitan area. So all of these reservoirs are still at about 100 to over 100% of average. Folsom, smaller, they have to, by federal regulations and state regulations, keep that a little bit lower, because if we get a big storm, it just would be tough to take in a bunch of water and to release a bunch of water as well. Traveling our way southward, New Melones, Don Pedro, some pretty big reservoirs there for the Central Sierra, still about 100 to almost 140% of average, and about 70 to 80% full San Luis, which has a little bit more flexibility there because it's an off-stream pumped water reservoir that sits just off towards, more towards the Bay Area here, kind of in between the Pacheco Pass. That one is over 100% of average. So it's kind of an opportunity to manage the water. Millerton at 80% of average. Okay, recent water years. Why are these reservoirs so high when we're in this dry stretch? The past couple of years have been decent water years. Last year was a little bit below average, but only by about an inch or so for downtown Sacramento, whereas the year before, that was our drought buster. After hitting 3 terribly dry years, we hit a really good water year in there, that drought buster year, 26.25 inches of rain. But most notable, it was the Central Sierra, Southern Sierra, which had historic high snowpack, and that helped to fill those reservoirs. So it was a really good year. Northern Sierra was one of the best years we've ever had on record as well. Okay, so are we going to dig out of this dry pattern? Well, let's take a look at a couple of different weather models. There are multiple weather models out there, but these two are kind of industry standard, but we could look at the national blend model as well. It's just, I'm just going to pull in these right now because in general, you get the idea. We've got the snowpack in the Sierra, potentially rain for Southern California on one model, the European model saying maybe a little bit less on that. But I think this really illustrates the idea that this is going to favor more of an eastern type of event on this for California than say on the West Coast. So that's just something to keep in mind. So we'll put the futurecast into motion, kind of see how this is playing out with one of those weather models. And you can see how it just kind of slides in the backside of the state, favors the Sierra again, providing 30% of our water for the water year. That would be a good thing to get the snowpack going again. I know there's a lot of skiers and snowboarders that say the machine-made snow is great, but it sure would be nice to get some fresh powder in there, not to mention for Southern California, drawing in some moisture as well by the time we get into the weekend forecast, which is possibly going to linger into our Sunday as well. Now, you can see this is not going to be a huge atmospheric river, very thin plume of moisture coming into Southern California, whereas the northern part of the state is really struggling to get a big bulk of moisture coming in. The atmospheric rivers are just bypassing California right now. We really saw several of them come in early in the season, but so far they just really have not been favoring us. So it's something that we were actually somewhat anticipating could be the case with a La Nina year. It tends to favor a wetter than average Pacific Northwest, whereas Southern California tends to be drier than average. Looking at the 8 to 14-day climate outlook, what can we expect? Well, slightly likely warmer for the eastern side of the state, likely cooler for the southern part of the state. This is going to be a wider range, longer outlook. The one that I showed you that had that cold pocket of air, that's just going to be very short-lived. Likely warmer, though, by the way, for the eastern half of the country, which will be good for them. Just it's been so bitterly cold throughout much of the eastern half of the country. So we're starting to see things moderate ever so slightly. Now, flip side of things, we talked about the temperatures for the precipitation. It is looking likely drier as we end January and begin February. So this weekend weather system, we really need to pull something out of this because we're right back to that dry pattern. Highs for tomorrow near 50 for the high country. We're in the 50s and lower 60s for the foothills. You'll notice those overnight lows are quite cold as well. Patchy frost will continue, especially for outlying areas. For the Bay Area, we're in the low 60s after morning lows right around 40. That's pretty chilly for the Bay Area as well. Our Central Valley forecast, morning lows starting off in the upper 20s, lower 30s, which will give us some patchy frost. Highs will warm to near 60. One little issue that we're also tracking is air quality. We're seeing areas of some pretty poor air quality with everybody using their fireplaces and wood-burning stoves. That's putting a lot of particulate matter out there, and without the wind with us, it means all of that stays very close to the surface. All right, to look at our 5-day regional forecast for the mountains, we keep it dry through Friday. Slight chance of showers coming in. You'll notice those colder afternoon highs for the foothills will drop into the 40s, and for the coast will be in the 50s and 60s. Our 3-day forecast for the valley, highs in the 50s for our Tuesday, low 60s for our midweek outlook. Again, those are going to be some of the warmer days of the work week forecast, which is a very short one. For many people, they had Monday off, and then showers, a possibility Saturday and Sunday. Our confidence is fairly low on that, but we'll certainly be watching it because then we head right back to the dry weather.